It's a little quiet. It's a little quiet. So we're going to revamp this. Good morning, church. Good morning. Hey, there we go. Okay, how y'all feeling? All right. Good. Okay, it's good to see this. It's good to see everyone. It's been a while.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Not that long, right? It's just a week. It was just a week. Okay, just a week. And so last time we got together, we were reading through Mark 8, and I shared with you guys that it was going to be a two-part message, right? You guys remember that?
Yeah.
Okay, some remember, some don't. That's fine. I'm not going to get on you right now. I'm just going to do a little recap, okay? So we're going to recap this together, right? It's like watching a TV show, and in the beginning they do the previously on, right? So we're going to have a little previously on Mark. We got a little Mark, right? So we'll jump in there. We can turn to Mark 8, verse 11. It reads, the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus and to test him. And they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply. Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it. Then he left them to go back and got back on the boat and crossed to the other side. Okay, y'all remember us kind of talking about this?
Yeah.
Remember us kind of going into this a little bit? We defined a couple of terms. We talked about spiritual blindness and how we could be blind spiritually. And we used this to talk about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Good. Okay, all right, so that's good, right? One of the first points we talked about is how spiritual blindness loves company, right? Loves company. Now, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they were pretty familiar with each other, right? No, they were like polar opposites, right? Mortal enemies, pretty much. Ideologically, they were not on the same page. And remember the quote that we shared there, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And that's exactly what we saw here in the relationship between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, right? The Pharisees were conservative, legalistic. The Sadducees were liberal and immoral. And they hated each other, but they united under what? Right? Their common hatred of who? Jesus. They were united under this. And then the second point we talked about that Sunday was how truth is what? Irrelevant. There we go. Somebody's with me. That's encouraging. I appreciate that. All right? And we talked about this point, how truth is irrelevant to many people because, we see here clearly. What were they asking from Jesus? They wanted what? They wanted a sign. They wanted a sign. Now, has Jesus never performed a sign that they had seen up until this point? No, right? Jesus has done many signs up until this point. And we talked about how in their culture they would say things like demons could do what type of signs? Earthly signs, right? But only God could do what type of signs? Heavenly signs, right? And when we say heavenly, we means what? We're talking about literally from the sky, right? Like things that affect up there, in the area they're not at. And Jesus obviously, they've seen that, how people stop the sun and do different things like that. That's what they were talking about. So they wanted a God sign. Show us you are from God, right? That type of sign. I shared a quote to kind of tie into this point by Voltaire, as a German atheist. And I'll read it again just to kind of bring us back into this mindset. Because I kind of need us to come back here before we go into what we're going to be going into with the disciples. But remember the quote from this German atheist. He said this. He said, even if a miracle should be rooted in the open market before 1,000 sober witnesses, I would rather mistrust my senses than admit a miracle. Right? And we talked about how some people take these like huge stances where it's like, I don't care what you do. I believe what? What I believe, right? You know what I mean? I believe what I believe. I don't need the miracle ain't gonna change it. I've made my decision. It doesn't matter. And that's where the Pharisees and the Sadducees were. Again, we're not talking about pagan people who don't care about God, didn't care about religion. We're talking about people who are what? Religious, committed to the faith. Committed, like hardcore, to an extent that we will never be. Right? Like they were in it, but they were like, we're committed not to necessarily the faith. We're committed to what? Our traditions or even our interpretation of the faith. It's really big to hold on to, because it's really easy for all of us to be committed to what? Our interpretation of the faith, right? And what that means, and I don't care what the scripture says, I don't care how, is what people, I have my interpretation, I have my way of seeing it, I am committed to that, that's just the way it is, and I'm good. Served me and my family well, right? We talk about the Sadducees and the Pharisees, we defined them, we went into clear, distinction of what they were, their history, their lineage, how it was expressed in their times, and it was some pretty intense stuff, right? Sadducees and all that, like we saw that. If you didn't see it, you can go back, it's on Facebook, it's a great message, check it out, right? That was kind of weird to say, but anyway. Needless to say, right? Jesus' response to that question that give us a sign, what was his response? Right? No! You're not getting a sign. Matter of fact, remember we translate that in the actual, when you really literally look at what he was saying in the Greek? Do you remember what it said? Anyone remember?
If I give this generation another sign, may I die?
Yes! There we go. Let's go. Let's go. Right? That was the literal sign. He said, if I give this generation another sign, may I die. No more signs. I am done. You guys, I've done all this. I already know where you're at. You're not trying to follow me. You're trying to crucify me. So let's play. That was pretty much it. It's done. Kind of intense, right? It was kind of intense. And then we talked about this permanent, the third point was about permanent blindness. And you're pretty much, they're set there. They were set there. And we talked about when you read the corresponding scripture to this, which was what? Who remembers that? The corresponding scripture to Mark 8. Matthew. Huh? Not 28, we're going to go there, but that's not it. The correspondence to this actual encounter.
15.
Huh?
15 and 16.
Yeah. Right? I like quizzing you guys. Come on. I told you, we're going to go through the book of Mark. I want y'all to go through it with me, right? We're going to go through it together, so we're building on this, right? And he said that there will be a sign in the corresponding one, right? What was the sign he said there will be? The sign of Jonah. And what was the sign of Jonah? Anyone remember the sign of Jonah? 3 days in the belly of the whale, right? And which corresponded to Jesus that he will be what? 3 days in the grave, right? And that was the corresponding. He's like, this will be the final sign, the last sign for you. If you really want a sign, this was it. This will be your sign. And how was their response? Right? And here's the thing. It's not even that they missed it. It actually just proved everything else, because they didn't miss it. They experienced it, right? But as Anna was sharing, Matthew 28:11, it says very clearly, here's what their response was to that final sign. And we're going to look at this. Their response was this. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priest everything that happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him because we know he will be after you. I added that. We'll satisfy him and we'll keep you out of trouble. So, the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated amongst the Jews to this very day. Right? And so this is what has happened. The story was widely circulated. So it wasn't that they missed the sign. They didn't see the sign. They didn't know about the sign. They heard about the sign. And what did they decide to do? Cover it up. Which is what Jesus knew way back then. Right? And that's when he said, my attention to trying to convince you is done. I'm done. I'm going to focus on those who are actually looking for light, who are looking for truth, who are desiring to see something greater. And it says that at the end of it, he did what? Mark 8:13, he left them. He left them. Matter of fact, got on a boat on the other side of the lake, right? He was like, I'm gone. I'm done. He left them, and he left them in their darkness. So in the midst of this major confrontation, one would think the disciples' response to all this would be what? What do you think? Their response to all this would be what? I don't want to be that. How do I not fall into this? Like, wow. I mean, that's a pretty intense conversation with the people who influence them the most, right? And their culture. Should be like, yo, tell us more about this. Help us out. Well, now we get into where we're going to be studying out the response. It says the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. Verse 14, it says, the disciples have forgotten to bring bread. This is immediately right after this encounter. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf they had on the boat with them. What were they thinking about? After all that major confrontation, what were they thinking about? Think about lunch. They were thinking about lunch. Some of y'all are probably thinking about it now, but that's a whole thing. You don't admit that. Don't admit it. You're being recorded, okay? Come on, guys. Right? You know, they're thinking about lunch. In the midst of this huge confrontation between faith and rejection, the thing that's on their mind is bread. Seems pretty shallow, right? Right? It's like, come on, disciples. If I was there. Right? I know you're thinking that. Come on, disciples. They couldn't figure this out. That's why. Jesus should have chosen me, right? It's easy, again, I always make this comment, man. We love to get on the disciples and we hate to see how much we're just like them. Maybe even worse. Off in some situations. But we look at this here, and I want us to catch this. When you walk in the light, you become more comfortable with the light. See, as I talked about last time, we're all born spiritually blind. All of us. We all miss it. We all are missing things. It really depends on the environment and what you're being taught and your heart if you're going to be open to experiencing and learning more about the truth. Right? Anyone ever like drive at night? You know, driving down the highway at night. What's like the worst thing about driving at night? Huh? Yeah, right? It's like one of the high beams, right? Especially like the oncoming traffic, right? Those lights hitting your eyes, right? It's like, it's so hard. Like, why is that so frustrating? Yeah, you're temporarily blind, but what's going on with your eyes? Right? They're getting adjusted to the dark, right? And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, here comes this light, and it's like this adjusting period. It's frustrating. I can't stand it. You know, I had my wife drive at night. We were leaving from the Moyers, and she's learning how to drive a little bit, and that was like, I remember she used to make fun of me because I would always complain about at night. I'm like, I gotta wear some sunglasses just to kind of, especially here in Jersey. Everybody in Jersey loves to use their high beams. I don't know what that's about, but that's just the way it is, you know. And so everyone got their high beams on. It's killing me. She would make fun of me. And so now she was driving. She's like, I can't see. And I was like, look at you. You know, welcome to my world, right? She did a great job driving too, though. It was incredible. I just want to put that out there. Jesus left behind the blind guys, the people that were like, look, we are committed to the darkness. We don't want no light. But he turned his attention to who? His apostles, right? He literally turned his attention to his apostles. And here's the thing. The apostles and the disciples here literally left everything to follow Jesus. I mean, what they literally just watched was not just a confrontation between Jesus and some religious leaders. They literally were watching a confrontation between their rabbi, their Messiah, and their culture. Y'all catch that? Like they were literally watching a confrontation between who they're choosing to follow and everything they've been raised to believe. Everything. The people that they were raised to look up to, the people that they were raised to push culture, to maintain their way of living and their lifestyle, the people that influence everyone they love and care about, they were literally watching that confrontation being played out before their very eyes. Isn't that crazy? And the first thing they think about is what? They think about food. They didn't catch what was going on in the moment. They didn't catch that it wasn't even just a confrontation. It was pretty much like Jesus drew the line in the sand there between them and culture. Them and the religious leaders of their time. And it's funny when you, his warning he shared here, he said, verse 15, he says, be careful. Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and who? And that of Herod. Now someone else got kind of introduced into this. Before, it's the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? And now who's introduced into the conversation to be careful of? Who? Herod, right? It's a double warning of the influences of the Pharisees. Matthew 16 adds the Sadducees. And here it's added Herod as well. All the influential people. Pharisees, the conservative, legalistic, religious group. Sadducees, the liberal, immoral group. So who's Herod in this? Politics. The political aspect of all this. So let's talk a little bit about the Herodians. Talk a little about the Herodians here, all right? Let's give a little history lesson on this. The secularist government that now is running Judea, Jerusalem, and all this. You know, is it just me, but when I read through, anyone ever read through, this kind of stuck out. Herod, right? This whole Herod thing. I was like, okay, Herod, who is Herod? Like, let me catch this. Herod is all over the New Testament. Literally, it's like, then Herod did this, and then Herod did that. And I'm like, for a long time, I thought Herod was just one person. Anyone else related to that? Yeah. Okay, thank you. I feel better. Because Lawrence is looking at me funny. He just laughed at me, all right? I saw you, Lawrence. You laughed at me. I was like, yeah, Herod is just one person. That's all I'm saying. This one dude's everywhere. How is he everywhere? Like, it doesn't make sense. He's there before Jesus was born, and he's there arguing with Paul at the end of Acts. Like, how did this happen? And then I'm like, oh, there's many Herods. Anyway, Herod pops up over 50 times in the New Testament, right? It's all over through the New Testament. Now I want to talk a little bit about the history of Herod, right? And how this family became a political juggernaut in Judea. All right? And again, these are things that, I tell you, it's nuance. These little things we overlook and we don't even see it, so then it's hard to get the full gravitas of what Jesus is saying when he says, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. It's like, okay, And it's funny because sometimes we don't even dig that deep into it, which simply just exposes how we are just like the disciples. Yeah. Like that alone just like shows Jesus gave a pretty big one. Be careful. Watch out for this. And we're like, yeah, okay. But we bypass it to look for something else, right? You know, like what? We just go past it. How does this relate to us? You know, Rome needed someone who was going to represent Caesar, right? In Judea. But, you know, in order to do that, they're like, okay, we need someone to represent us, but they need to kind of mesh with the culture. Judea is a Jewish culture, so we need someone who's kind of Jewish to kind of represent it. Herod was not Jewish. I mean, they were kind of slightly connected genealogy, but was not Jewish. And actually, that's kind of one of the main reasons a lot of the Jews did not respect Herod and his leadership. They didn't like it because they looked at him as like a fake Jew, pretty much. And they had a problem with that. But they wanted to really establish a separation between the church and state. That was what Rome wanted to establish. So they had to put Herod in, you know, which is the first Herod, which is called Herod. Anyone know what his title was?
Herod the Great.
Herod the Great, right? The first one, the one that kind of headed up. Herod the Great was number one. He worked out the deal with Rome to kind of oversee Judea, and his family were in charge. Herod the Great, the first one, was very crazy and violent, okay? Clearly, he was literally insane, right? He struck a deal with Caesar to govern over the Jewish, the Jews, and that was pretty much set in place. And we know of Herod the Great because of a couple of pretty significant things that he did in the New Testament, right? The first one that he did, which is a pretty big deal, is that he ordered the execution of all babies around the birth of Jesus. Remember this? Mm-hmm. He was the guy that said he was felt threatened by the prophecy of Jesus and was like, hey, you know what? I don't need somebody trying to take over. I'm the king. I'm ruling. So he did that. I mean, to put that type of edict out, you got to be a little what? Yeah. Something's wrong, right? That was huge. He built a lot of great structures. He did a lot of stuff, a lot of things that he contributed to building. You literally could go back and see those buildings today. That was put up under his reign, right? They don't look as glorious as they used to look, but they're still there, right? And the people, though, really hated it because they were severely taxed and couldn't use any of these facilities, right, to build them. It was really built up for his name. And one of the craziest things that he did, Herod the Great, this kind of leads to why people just couldn't stand him, is that when he was on his deathbed, he knew that the community would not mourn his death. And so what he did to guarantee that people would be mourning when he died is he sent out another edict for his guards to go out and murder people. To go and just randomly just go and murder off people. So he said he did that mainly because he's like, I know they're not going to mourn me, but there will be mourning on my death. Wow. And this is what he did. Now, when he died, the guards did not carry out this edict, right? But it was widely known this is what he intended to do. So now we kind of get the mindset behind Herod the Great. Herod the Great had a couple sons, 3 sons, and they all led different parts of Judea. You know, Philip, he married his niece, and he built some great stuff in Caesarea Philippi, still there, just like I said. But then his other two sons, they were very unique, right? The other two, his name is Archelaus, right? He was in charge of the heart of Judea. And the thing that he did, which is really like off the wall, was, people really struggled with him because he's the one that came in power right after his father had passed. And people were terrified because they thought, oh, he's gonna pretty much do what his dad did and pretty much execute the babies. So there was a lot of conflict there with him. But he didn't come out to be that way. He actually was pretty fair. And people actually was like, okay, they were okay with his ruling. The third one, which is the one that pops up a lot, this is the one that executed John the Baptist, beheaded John the Baptist. This is the one that threatened to kill Jesus. He was like, I'm going to get you. Matter of fact, this is the one where my favorite line of Jesus is in the Bible. I think it's the best line that he said a lot of great stuff. But I love this one. Where Herod sends edict out saying that, hey, we're going to come get you. And Jesus says, you know what? Go tell that fox. Go tell that fox that I'm going to do what God kept brought me here to do, and nothing's going to stop me. Fun fact, that word fox in the original Greek word was in feminine form. Jesus, and the irony behind all of that, Jesus actually was on trial before this guy, right? And stood trial before him. So the Herodians, this family, they were pretty powerful. They're found throughout the scriptures. Obviously, later on, the grandson was the first king of Palestine. He attacked the church in Acts, was violently. He attacked the church. In Acts 12, you see that James was arrested under his reign and eventually executed. In Acts 12 again, Acts 12 and 13, you see that Peter as well was caught and was supposed to be executed. But we remember what happened with Peter there? What happened? Anyone remember?
God freed him.
Yeah, he miraculously escaped, right? Got away. But that was really big. And another just irony, fun fact, when you read through the history of this guy, he actually died while giving a speech publicly. And what happened was he was eaten by worms. Go look that one up. Right? It's very interesting when you kind of dig into that. What happened to him? Right? It wasn't like an actual big worm came out the ground and ate him, right? It was a disease that he had. But fun fact there. And then you see his other grandson was the one that actually stood before Paul in Acts 25 and literally told Paul, you know what? You might convince me to follow Jesus. Right? Y'all remember this in Acts 25? Right? That you stood before the king and persuaded him. Right? And almost persuaded him. Now, eventually, their whole rule fell apart. Rome eventually came in, killed the family, pretty much sacked Jerusalem, and history goes on from there. But I want to kind of give just a snippet of history about the Herodians because I want you to understand what they represented even when Jesus said this. So we talked a lot about the Pharisees, what they represented. We talked about the Sadducees, what they represented. But this secular government power, Jesus said, watch out for them. And watch out for the yeast. He says, be careful. He warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. Beware. Be careful. Who is influencing you? You have to ask yourself that. Like as Christians in the church, 2019, who's influencing you? Who's teaching you? Who's leading you? This is something that you have to be conscious of. Because if you're not conscious of it, if you're just walking around, just intaking, you're always taking in information. Like, know that. You're always taking in stuff. We live in a world where, everyone's trying to influence you. Data about you is the number one commodity in the world today. Higher than oil and other things. Data mining. Being able to figure out who you are, what you like, what you don't like, what you look at, what you care about, what your interests are. Why? Why do people want to know all that about you? I think it's not just to sell. It's to influence. Influence. You look on social media, some of the biggest people that people try to connect. What do they call people on social media? Influencers. So people want to get together with influencers. Why do people want influencers? Because what? They influence, right? Influence is powerful. It's a big thing. This is so important to young believers and old believers. Who's influencing you? Who's influencing you? In Ephesians talks about, us not being tossed around by every wind of teachings, right? Well, the only way that you can make sure you're not tossed around by every wind of teachings, you got to be very mindful and conscious of your influences. Beware of the influences of conservatism, legalism, liberalism, no morals, and secularism without God's absolute rule. These are influences, and it's funny because we see this stuff, right? We see this stuff all the time. And we don't like talking about these things, right? But these things influence us. Even the terms conservatism and liberalism and secularism. Those are three terms that we see where? Everywhere. You turn on the news, what are they talking about? Conservatives this, liberals this. Right? You hear this stuff all the time. Why? Because these are major ideologies that to this day we subscribe to. We believe. It's funny because yeast is a biblical illustration for influence. That's what yeast is. It's a biblical illustration for influence. What is influencing you? Yeast makes dough rise by bacterial corruption. Period. That's how it works. Bacterial corruption, it makes yeast rise. So the question you got to ask yourself, what is the yeast that's subscribing to you? And the Bible says what? How much yeast does it take to corrupt a batch of dough? It's just a little bit. A little yeast corrupts a whole batch. You can have a great batch and drop a pinch of yeast in it, and it corrupts the whole thing. So what is Jesus therefore saying about us? It doesn't matter how good you are, how solid you are, how great you are. How much does it take to corrupt you? So you need to be careful. Some of us think, oh, it's easy. I want to know. It just takes a little. Corrupts the whole batch. Whatever ideology you subscribe into, whatever mindset you're trying to tie it into, whatever. And here's the reality of this stuff. We take all those things and we like to do what as Christians? A conservative ideology, a liberal ideology, a secularist ideology. You like to take all that and do what as Christians? Rationalize it. Even what? Spiritualize it. Right? But really all we're doing is what? The Bible talks about itching ears. At the end of the day, we got to go back to the scriptures. What is God calling us to do? And see, how are we allowing a little yeast to corrupt the whole batch? Yeast is used twice positively. It's Matthew 13, Matthew 11, and that's where it's talking about advancing the kingdom. Right? Every other time, it's talking about the influence of sin. The influence of sin. Just because you're following me, you're still going to be surrounded by the Pharisees' religion, the Sadducees' liberalism, and the Herodian secularism. And that's the same with us today. Just because you're following Jesus, you're still surrounded by all this stuff, right? We're still surrounded by it. And this is why there's an invisible corrupting power if we're not conscious of it. And it's so important for us to be conscious of this stuff. And we walk around so ignorant. And the sad thing is we boast in our ignorance sometimes. I don't know what's going on. I don't really care about it. But what you don't know is all of that is influencing you. The sad thing is you just aren't aware of the influence until it's too late. Jesus is asking for a full break of all these satanic ideologies, right? All these ideas, and I say satanic, and I really mean it in the sense of it's just things that are so anti-Christ, right? Like just things that are anti-Christ. And sometimes we gotta challenge ourselves not to try to justify ideologies, but really try to find Christ in everything that we're doing, and be okay with some of these things that you might think is like I stand behind this. It might not be behind the cross. It might not be following that. And that's something that we have to talk about. This is why we as a church, we have to talk about these things. There are topics that are influencing us that are going on today we don't talk about. And this is what's sad, is that we come into church and we put on our church face. We talk about our church stuff. We only talk about church things at church. But where do we talk about everything else? Outside of church. And where's the greatest influence of everything else? Outside of church. So really, who are you? If you're the product of your greatest influences, see, that's the thing. We're not authentic in church a lot. We don't really like to talk about who we are, what we really believe, what we really think. And you know what happens when you don't talk about who you really are, what you really think, and what you really believe? You know what happens? It don't get challenged. And reality is sometimes we don't really want to be challenged, right? That's kind of it too. Like, I kind of like the way I think. And that's cool. I don't want to know, and that's where it goes back to that previous statement. Truth is irrelevant to some people because they're very content with who they are. You can have an ideology, it might be true, it might be false, but if it's true, can it stand up to a challenge? Truth can stand up to any challenge. Truth can stand up to any challenge. But if it can't be challenged, then it probably ain't true. And you're holding on to it. And that's dangerous. That's not good. See, I don't have no fear in my faith and talking about Jesus. That's a truth that it could be challenged. Challenge it. Attack it. Go against it. The cross is still here. Jesus is still being preached. Right? Through persecutions, through destructions, through manipulations, through being adulterated, it's still here. It still stands. A lot of other ideologies don't stand and will not stand the test of time. A lot of other ways of thinking will not stand. It might sound good, might make sense. You can find scriptures to justify it, because you can find things to justify anything you want to justify.
Exactly.
That's just the way it is. But truth will stand forever. It's timeless. It's timeless. And so we can't be afraid to talk about things. We can't be afraid to address the yeast, the different things going on in culture. We run from it too much. We run from topics like, and I know y'all are talking about it, things like abortion. We don't want to talk about it here, but I know people are talking about it. Things like homosexuality, things like women's rights and women's roles, even in the church. People don't want to talk about it, but I know y'all talking about it. I know you got an idea on it. I know you're thinking about it. I know it's running through your mind. But but that's not the church talk. But I'll go talk to my friends outside about it. I'll go talk to my other friends online about it. I'll watch videos on YouTube. I guarantee if I look through your YouTube curation, I know it ain't all Jesus. I know it's a whole lot of other stuff that you ain't talking about here. So who's fueling you? Who's feeding you? And you don't let it be challenged here. Why? You don't want the cross to interfere with it? You don't want the cross to confront it? It's like, no, I don't want the cross stuff. I think I've made sense of this here. It's dangerous. Democrats, Republicans, Donald Trump, all that stuff. Y'all got opinions. Barack Obama, whoever, we all got opinions. And you all talk about it, and everybody want to get emotional about it. Because it's emotional. Yeah. It does. These things move us. And that just lets you know how much more you need to be talking about it here. Because if it could move you that way, it'll probably move you somewhere. And it might move you out the church. It might move you right out the church. Authenticity is important. So much more important in the church. Stop being fake. Stop playing games. Talk about your stuff. Talk about your views. I always say the church should be the safest place on earth to talk about things. Should be. Right? Why isn't it? It's not because of Jesus. It's not because of the Bible. Because the Bible confronts it. If we don't put things into their proper biblical context, these things can become like yeast and defile us from within. And defile us from within. It could turn us against each other. It could turn us against each other. Church will cannibalize itself from within if we don't talk about these things. We have to check our ideologies at the cross. You have to check your ideologies at the cross, not try to justify them with the cross. It's very important. You know, we're in a new age, church, where we can't be cowards when it comes to these things. Can't hide. You got to talk about it. You got to have these confrontations. You got to have these conversations. The yeast defiles from within. Jesus makes this huge point. Grandiose point. Watch out. Be careful of the yeast of the Pharisees. And then he says this to the disciples, and what do they say? What is it? You know, if Jesus makes this huge point to us, Jesus up here, he's preaching, he says, you know, guys, be careful. The yeast of all these ideologies out here today come in and defile you. What would your comment be? Right? What's some of the questions? How can I recognize the yeast, Jesus? How do I recognize the yeast, Jesus? How do I not succumb to it, Jesus? How do I really protect myself from it, Jesus? What does it look like? How do I protect myself and my family from this? Jesus, that's a great point. Let's talk about it. What are we going to do to provide an alternative, Jesus? Those are some logical questions after such a statement, right? Verse 16, they say, then they discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. Right? After such a grand statement, they're like, you know what? You know, Peter, I told you to get the bread. Like, this is why he's talking about yeast. You know, I mean, leaven. You know, and as he said, the leaven, right? It's technically he talks about. He says leaven in other translations. He's like, what he wanted flat bread, and we brought this yeast bread. Now, you know, like, we messed up. We should have brought flat bread, right? We totally missed the point. Totally missed the point. They missed the entire meaning of the warning. They thought he was talking about actual bread. Wow. That's what they thought. You know? And I always say, man, if Jesus had trouble keeping the audience attention, man, I know I'm in trouble. I just like, man, he couldn't even keep the disciples' attention. I sat there reading this and preparing for this sermon. I'm like, how am I going to keep their attention? Like, Jesus couldn't keep, that was an epic statement. You know, I know people thinking about bread right now. I know you are. All this, you know, you keep saying bread. Now everybody's like, you know, I guarantee tonight you're going to have bread in your dinner or lunch somewhere. There's going to be some bread added into it. You know, man, I sit back, I'm always worried about that. But we all hear through the grid of our preoccupations, right? Whatever we're preoccupied with, that's how we hear anything that's coming into us with, right? It's just the way of the world. It's the way of life. The leaders asked for more signs. Jesus said no. Those who love darkness, are comfortable in darkness, will only be led to more darkness. Those who love the light, those who are comfortable with the light, will be led to more light. Here's the part that's interesting. The Pharisees asked for more signs, and Jesus said, what? No. Right? The disciples totally missed the point. Totally missed the point. Like, we're far off the point. And how did Jesus respond to them? You say, we ain't even talking about this anymore. I'm done. New disciples. Open up registration again. We'll bring in some new people. I don't know what I was thinking. I had a lot of faith in you, obviously. Right? No. Matter of fact, what did he do? He walks them through it, right? He's like, okay. Y'all don't get it. No problem. Okay. Actually, it's a bit frustrating. I'm going to be honest. But let's talk about it, right? He says there, verse 17, aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? He's pretty much, with these statements, he's equating them to who? The Pharisees, right? He's pretty much like, are you not just like the people? It's obvious who your influences have been. Because you're being like them. Right? And then he goes on and says, don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves and the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces of bread did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves and the 4,000, for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? Matter of fact, I just fed 4,000 in the same chapter. Right? Just blew it up. This literally just happened like a couple days ago, guys. Why would I complain about bread when I could take 1 loaf and feed thousands? What are you talking? This just happened, right? You know, in the stress of our present moments, we can forget what God has done in our past, right? You ever think about that? Like in the stress of our present moments, we could totally forget what God has done in the past.
Yeah.
I mean, we could forget what God has done just a few hours ago. Ever happened, right? Like God did something great. You say, thank you, God. Then you drive home and you're in the car and you get home and something else pops up and you're like, oh my goodness, everything's bad, right? Like the world's falling apart. I don't even know. You just totally forget who God was. You were just praising him here and now you're cursing your life here. We could be so like up and down like that, right? Forget that God cares. Sometimes all you need to do to get over your present is to remember what God has done in your past. Sometimes you just got to be very conscious of who God is and remember who God is. This is why all over, especially in the Old Testament, what's the consistent thing that's said all in the Old Testament? Remember. Remember the Lord your God. Remember the Lord your God. Remember he saved y'all? Remember he saved us? Remember he did that? And you didn't think he could do it, but he did it? Do you remember? Remember that. It's important to remember that. Why? Because you're going to forget. And we forget. You know, I love how at the end of that, in Matthew 16, it says, y'all catch what it says in Matthew, at the end of Matthew? After you said all that? It says, then they remembered. And then they understood. Now, you can look at this one of two ways. You can look at this as like, Jesus made a statement, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod. They talked about bread. Jesus explains it. You would think it's an easy, right? It's pretty, it wasn't like rocket science here, right? You know, I was sharing this in a study with T and Chooks, and we were talking about the scripture where Jesus said, if salt loses saltiness, what good is it anymore? And I asked the question, I was like, you know, how does salt lose its saltiness? And they start talking about ions and, you know, the periodic table and all this stuff. And I was like, okay, I don't even know what that means. But, you know, and I literally, it was like a little 5-minute, you know, diatribe. They were going in on this whole concept of, yeah, if, you know, the molecules break up and then this happens. And I was like, okay, it was a simple question, all right? It was a simple question, right? It got wet, so now it's not salty. Right? That's it. That's all I had to say. You know, I'm like, geez, right? These Princeton students, you know, that's what happens. You know, but, you know, so I'm like, but, you know, we can take things that are very simple, right? It's a very, very simple thing. We can look at that like, come on, cycle, it's a simple thing. But Jesus walked them through it and helped them get over it. I really wanted to highlight that because I feel we're not very gracious with ourselves. There's some things that we just feel like we don't get, and we don't understand how Jesus is so patient with us. to walk us to understanding, to walk us through it. Yeah, you don't get it now, but I got you. You just stay with me. You just stay with me. You stay close. You'll get it eventually. And I think we need to always remember this with Jesus. We need to remember it with ourselves. We need to remember it when we're dealing with other people. We need to remember when we're helping others that Jesus is very patient with us. Right? We're not that patient with other people, and we're not very patient with ourselves. And when you don't levy that level of patience with yourself and with others, you know what you do to people? You walk away from them. You know what you do to yourself? You walk away from yourself. Self-hatred. Let's not do that. The disciples stayed close to Jesus. And he walked them through something that should have been very easy. Bless you. You don't get it done. You don't get it. Snatching up all the blessings. You know. Let's be patient with one another. Let's love each other. Let's understand that these complicated things in the Bible are only going to come through us talking about it and helping each other to understand it. And how do we discipline all this under the cross of Jesus? And to God be the glory. Thanks, guys. You know, as we're continuing on with our summer series and